We are ready to get started. I want to welcome you here today. My name is Ben Sharda. I'm the Executive Director of Kansas City Community Gardens. And today we're going to be talking about garden soils, compost, and fertilizer. And feel free to ask questions as we go along. If we get too many questions, then we might hold them off to the end. And if you're not familiar with Kansas City Community Gardens, maybe this is your first time here, there's lots of information out in the front about us. We have a little newspaper that has a list of our seeds and plants. And the way that it works is you can actually join and become a member of the Kansas City Community Garden. And there's different levels of membership. It's based on your income. But I'm sure some of you are members already. What membership does, it gets you 10 packs of seed, a sack of fertilizer, which we'll talk about the fertilizer today. And you also get, you're able to buy plants and garden supplies at low cost. And the whole idea is to make it affordable for people to garden. And we're trying to encourage people to garden all over the city. We work with schools. We work with like over 300 schools. There's Hannah, our schoolyard gardens coordinator. We work with community partner gardens, any kind of not-for-profit that wants to do a garden, like some churches are doing food pantry gardens or a neighborhood association, women's shelter or group homes, all kinds of community partner gardens. And we also have community orchards, which we call our giving grove. Some of them are small, like just 5 trees, but some of them are big. And so think of like fruit trees and berry bushes that are community orchards. And then we have our special children's garden, which is called the Beanstalk Children's Garden, which is outside here, right outside the door. It doesn't look like much right now, but come back in June, July, August, September, and it'll be gorgeous. Come back and just walk around, and that's one good way to learn about some of the plants we grow. Is you'll see them growing out there and see what they look like, and see how much space they take, and what they look like when they're growing well. So anyhow, that's just a really fun thing to do, even if you don't have children or grandchildren. You can come and look at that. But anyhow, there's more membership information out in front, and things like planting calendars. And then these workshops here are actually online, and you can go back and look at previous ones that we've done, even from previous years. If you weren't able to come to one of them, then that is a good way to check up on that kind of stuff. And I think that's it. We're going to go ahead and get started. So garden soils are one of the things that I get the most questions about. And almost every gardener, knows enough that they need to know they have good soil, but how do you know if it's good soil or not? So there's a lot to learn. It's a process, and you won't learn it all at once. Also, I forgot to mention, if anybody's interested in the presentation today, we can email that to you. We can email you a PDF of it and just send it to contact@kccg.org or ask about in front office, and then we can just send it to you if you want to look at the notes later. But obviously, good soil is what you need if you're going to have a productive garden. That's one of the things, like in that raised bed there, when we fill up raised beds at a school or a community garden, we put some really good stuff in there. It's a mixture of half compost and half topsoil. And that's something we'll talk about today too. So here's the characteristics. How do you know if something's a good soil? So it will have, and we'll talk about each one of these, a high level of organic matter, adequate levels of nutrients. You need your nutrients, just like people need nutrients. The pH, if you remember from junior high and high school, we talked about pH. That's like how acid is it or how alkaline is it? And then it needs to be deep enough. If your soil was only this deep, it wouldn't be very good because the roots go down deeper than that. And you want good soil structure. And that's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but we'll talk about that. And of course, drainage, you don't want it to stay soggy. And then, of course, you don't want toxic materials. That's kind of unusual, but still worth talking about a little bit. And then you also don't want your soil to be full of either lots of weed seeds or aggressive perennial weeds. There are certain weeds that will just take over your garden if you let them go. And so you want to know a little bit about those. We talk about those more in our weed workshop, which I think is, I don't know if we're doing it this year, but for sure you can see it online. All right, so the biggest thing about characteristics of a good soil is it'll have a high level of organic matter. And all that means is, we'll talk more about organic matter, but that's That's the most important thing you can do to improve your soil is to add organic matter. And there's different kinds of organic matter, but organic matter is constantly decomposing. So you need to add it continually. So let's say you added a bunch of compost to your garden 2 years ago. Well, you might want to add some more this year. Don't have to do it every year, but every 2 or 3 years, it's good to add some organic matter. And so it could be the mulch, like if you put mulch on top of your garden at the end of the season, you could fill that in. That's another way to add organic matter. Or in the fall, maybe you have a friend who has a farm, you can go get some manure from them. We'll talk about that, but you can just add that in and kind of work it in, till it in at the end of the season. But the best time to add that organic matter is in the fall. If it's already composted, it's okay to add it in the spring. But if it's something that's, like just a bunch of leaves or a bunch of manure, it's probably better to add that in the fall rather than the spring. So, because it needs time to kind of break down and start digesting. The benefits of organic matter is it increases the water holding capacity. Because when summer comes and you're out there watering, if you don't have very much organic matter in the soil, the water will evaporate quicker and it won't last as long. But so think of organic matter as kind of like a sponge, helps hold that water in the soil so the plants can have it when they need it. The other thing is, and this has to do with that soil structure, is the pore space. So if you think of soil, it's a whole bunch of little tiny particles. Think of like sand, and in between those particles, there are little air spaces. And when you have lots of organic matter in there, it helps so those air spaces don't get squished out. If you have just clay soil, it gets squished out, and those little air spaces are very tiny, and they get all filled up, and they don't hold much air or they don't hold water. So having organic matter makes the little particles bigger and leaves more air spaces in between the particles. It also increases the ability of the soil to hold nutrients. If you had a real sandy soil and you put fertilizer in it and then you water it, it'll just wash right through. But if you have organic matter, that'll hold the nutrients in the soil so they don't wash on through. And then the other thing, organic matter, as you might suspect, all the little soil microbes, fungi, bacteria, all the good little things that help, make the soil chemical reactions happen, that make the fertilizer available for the plants to use and for the plant roots to grow. That all happens in the presence of organic matter. So if you have just solid clay or solid sand, there's not going to be much soil microbes happening. And so that is definitely important. And then the other thing, just practical standpoint, if you're a gardener, if you have lots of organic matter in there, it makes it the texture. You like a nice loose soil, so it crumbles nicely. It's easy to take a fork and just turn it over, and it just crumbles apart. And it's easy to till, and it just is so much better. Out in our children's garden here, we have really good soil. We started off with good soil because we added a lot of organic matter at the beginning, but then we add the mulch at the end of each year. We till that in, and that just makes it richer and stronger and crumblier. And it's almost like a potting soil. It's so loose and really nice. So another characteristic of good soil, it will have enough of the essential plant nutrients. And you don't need to remember all this, although the first one's probably more important. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are what they call the major nutrients, or sometimes they call them the macronutrients. Those are like the three most important things. And so when you buy a fertilizer, you'll see it'll have like those three numbers there like that. And that refers to what the percentage is of those three nutrients. So what that means is you got 10% nitrogen here, you got 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. And that shows you it's kind of a balanced fertilizer. Some of the other nutrients that are important are calcium, sulfur, and magnesium. And lots of times they'll be added into different fertilizers. We'll talk more about fertilizers here in a minute. So those are what they call the major nutrients, the ones that plants need the most of. And especially that, I will tell you right now, most of the soils around here have phosphorus in them. They have potassium in them. Sometimes they have a little too much potassium. But the nitrogen is something that is just always getting used up. And it kind of, as you water, it goes through the soil. And the other thing is it kind of evaporates out of the soil. So that nitrogen, the nitrogen is what fuels the green growth. It's what makes the plant spurt up. and put out new leaves and new shoots, new branches, and all that stuff. But if you use too much nitrogen, that will slow down the fruiting or the flowering and fruiting process. So, like if you're trying to grow tomatoes and you put too much nitrogen fertilizer on there, you'll get a big green plant, really strong, but it won't have very many blossoms on it. So we'll talk about, holding off on the fertilizer at a certain point. But it is what makes the plant get big and healthy and leafy and all that stuff. But these are some minor nutrients. You don't need to worry about these because almost every soil around here, at least, has enough of these in it already. Especially if you're adding some compost or adding organic matter, it'll be in that too. So all these other things, just like people, need all the different vitamins and things like that, and different minerals. Just plants need that also. All right, so just a quick definition of what actually is fertilizer. It's something that you add to the soil that will provide concentrated essential plant nutrients. So all those nutrients we were just talking about, they'll be concentrated in the fertilizer. So now compost is a little bit different. It has some nutrients in it, but it's not so compost. So if your garden is low in nutrients, the answer is to add fertilizer. If your garden is low in organic matter, the answer is to add organic matter. And that'll help provide some nutrients, but this is like, think of this as more like your vitamin pill, and you're eating a loaf of bread. That's where you get your fiber and all that stuff that will make you healthy. But you need some vitamins and you need the bulk food. So the other thing about if it's a commercial fertilizer, something you're buying in the store, it has to show what that percentage is. If it doesn't show what that percentage is, it's actually not a fertilizer. So it might just be a soil amendment. Like you can buy compost. Some of the compost, in fact, we'll see some pictures in it. They won't show what the nutrients are because there's not that much in there. There are some, but it's going to be like less than 1%. So, but if it's concentrated and it's a fertilizer, they have to show you what that percentage is. So here's the 5, 10, 5. A little bit higher in the middle one, the phosphorus, because sometimes that helps like the root growth if you're having problems with that. If you're trying to plant like flowering bulbs, lots of times you'll have something that's a little bit higher in phosphorus, like that. Oops. So here's the difference between chemical fertilizer and organic fertilizer. And I will tell you, I'm a big fan of organic fertilizer. So chemical fertilizer is produced by processing chemicals, and that's not bad because, right now, to make enough fertilizer to feed the world, like big farms, it would be hard to get enough organic fertilizer for that. But organic fertilizers are produced from organic materials like manure, seaweed, sometimes fish, things like that. We'll look at that here in a minute. Chemical fertilizers are more concentrated. The percentages will be higher. The organic fertilizers is not going to have quite as much nutrients in it, but it'll be slow release. So chemical fertilizers, it's a fast release, and then it's gone quicker, so you might have to put more down later, especially if you have lots of rain. But the organic fertilizer releases it over a longer period of time. Now, if you go to this nursery, you can buy some slow release chemical fertilizers. They're more expensive. I know one of them is called Osmocote, and you'll see it, and you'll see like little tiny balls inside there, and sprinkle that under soil, and it just releases it slowly. And that is a good way to do it. But again, it's a chemical fertilizer. And then it's also, with chemical fertilizers, it's easy to do too much because it is so concentrated. If you sprinkle it out, put out too much, you can actually put out enough that it will damage your plants. Because basically fertilizers they're salts. They're not like table salt, but they are chemical salts. And that's really hard on the roots if you get too much. So if you've got the chemical fertilizer, because it's more concentrated and it releases faster, if you dump too much, it will hurt your plants. Classic case here at Community Gardens, we do sell chemical fertilizer because some gardens really prefer that, and that's fine. You're used to that. But like what some people do is they'll take like a half a cup or a teaspoon, and they'll just put it in the hole, and they'll set their tomato plant right on top. And the next day, their plant will be dead because it's just too much. And they'll call us and say, "My plant died." And we'll say, "Did you use some fertilizer?" And we'll ask them about it. Just put it in the planting hole. So yes. So don't do that. So it's not good. The organic fertilizer, much less likely to do over fertilizer and damage the plants because it's not as concentrated, and also it releases it slowly over a longer period of time. And of course, the cost, chemical fertilizers are cheaper per pound, organic fertilizers are more expensive. We'll talk about a little bit more specific stuff here. I think I got some slides coming up. Yeah, so there you just see some chemical fertilizers. There's Miracle Grow. There's one up above called Schultz. Miracle Grow comes as a powder. You mix it with water, and then you put it on. There's other kinds of chemical fertilizers that just come as like granules, and that's what the kind we have is basically like a farm fertilizer. It's a triple 13, and you just sprinkle it out and fill it in, and it works like that. If you are going to do a chemical fertilizer, I do kind of like the ones that mix with water because then it's just easy to put on, and then you'll see some results pretty soon. And so you'll think to yourself, okay, I don't need to do this. It'll have instructions like, do it every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, or whatever, and it'll tell you like how much to put in a gallon of water. So just make sure you follow those instructions completely. And then so the organic fertilizers, you can buy some liquid ones. There's a fish fertilizer, which, sounds a little weird, but, Native Americans actually used to use the fish to fertilize their corn. This product in the middle is called Age-Old Grow. It's higher in nitrogen. And then here's the one that we sell here it's a chicken manure fertilizer. And just to explain a little bit about it, it's obviously made from chicken manure, but it's been composted. So it's not too fresh, it's not going to hurt your plants. I mean, that doesn't mean you couldn't overdo it by putting too much down. But you can see the formula on that is like 5, 3, 2.5. So it's a little higher in nitrogen, which is good. And then the phosphorus is 3%, potassium is 2.5%. So that's a nice percentage. It comes in little pellets. I don't know if you've ever seen like alfalfa pellets, like to feed a guinea pig. It's kind of what it looks like. And then as it gets wet, they eventually break down. And I was going to put a video on here, but I didn't have time to get it on here. It's on our website. It tells you how to do it. Basically, you just sprinkle it out in the garden, and it's like 2 pounds per 100 square feet. And so like 2 cups equals a pound. We've got a little sheet up at the front office that will tell you about that. And you sprinkle it out, and then just take a rake and just rake it in so you don't see it all on the top. Or you can take a tiller and just till it in. And then usually, if it's a short season crop, like just a spring crop, just doing it once is enough. If you're going to have a long season crop, like tomatoes, you might do it once early and then once later, so like that. Again, just to warn you about it, so, chicken manure can be smelly. So you don't want to probably keep it in your house. The other thing is you don't want to get it wet. So keep it someplace like in the garage in plastic bags so it won't get wet. Because once it gets wet, it gets kind of stinky and hard to put down. So it'll last for a long time if you keep it inside its plastic bag. And we also sell extra. You get 1 bag with your membership. And then if you need extra, you can buy extra. But we've just had really good results with this. We buy a whole truckload of it each year. And gardeners really like it. It does really well. Again, because it has this nice slow release of the nitrogen. So depending on what kind of fertilizer you have, if you ever get a soil test, it'll come back with some instructions that tell you about how much fertilizer to add. And you can follow that. Like it'll tell you so many pounds of like 10, 10, 10 fertilizer per 100 square feet of that. And they would be talking about a chemical. But if you don't have a soil test, no need to worry. That's generally not a requirement. What you're trying to do in that case is put down enough nutrients that your plants are going to use up for this season. And so that's where, like, the organic fertilizer, 2 pounds of the organic fertilizer per 100 square feet. So that'd be like 2 raised beds or 10 by 10 square foot garden, 2 pounds of it, and sprinkle it out over that. And then rake it in, and you're good to go. Just try not to put too much in one place. Yeah.
How can you get in your soil?
Okay, that is a great question. And you know what? I thought I had some slides on here, but you know what? I'm not sure they're in here. If we come to it later, I'll tell you more. Basically, you know what? I do remember there are some slides. We'll get to that later because that's a very good question. I get that a lot from gardeners. Yeah, we'll get to that after a little bit here. All right, let's talk about compost because you know you hear the terms fertilizer, you hear compost, you hear mulch. What are these things? So mulch is something you're going to put on top of the garden. And we talk about that in our basic gardening class. Usually it's something like straw, could be cotton burr, composted cotton burr, could be grass clippings. Some people use ground up leaves as a mulch. Some people use wood chips. I don't recommend that as a mulch for vegetable gardens. But mulch is what you put on top so the soil doesn't dry out. So like 2 inches, maybe even 2.5 or 3 inches. And it also just stops the soil from drying out too quickly and keeps it cooler when it's hot summer. So that is mulch. Compost is organic material that you're going to mix in with the soil. And so it's organic material that has decomposed to a stable state. So think of it, all organic material is decomposing all the time. Sometimes it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. And so by organic material, it refers to anything that once was alive. So think of like, you know, manure came from live animals, right? You can buy different animal products, but also you can buy things like alfalfa, composted alfalfa. You can like leaves would be organic matter, grass clippings, straw, compost that you buy from a compost place. That's all organic matter, and that's compost. And so you can see in that picture up on top, see how it's smoking? When you have a really good compost pile, it will heat up, and that decomposition process will be breaking down the complex organic matter molecules into simpler form, like water and carbon and the different nutrients, and energy will be released, and it'll actually heat up. A really good compost pile from an organic like compost company will heat up to like 140 degrees, and that also kind of pasteurizes the soil in a good way, kills some of the bad insects, plus some weed seeds and things like that. So anyhow, you can see from the picture on the bottom, so there's compost, somebody's making a compost pile and they're just like throwing their plant refuse in there, like the dead plants, the leaves and weeds and things like that. And it takes a while, but when it's done, it's going to look kind of like what you think of rich, dark topsoil. Because that's a good sign of rich, dark topsoil, because it has organic matter in it, and it's black, crumbly, and look almost like soil. Commercial compost versus homemade compost. So like at a big compost operation, you know, they use things like shredded leaves, they use lawn clippings, they'll use ground up wood chips. And if they're composted properly, those wood chips will be ground up fine enough that they'll decompose quickly. If you just use wood chips in your garden, they're going to take a long time to decompose, and it will steal nitrogen out of your soil and make your plants be suffering for nutrients. But anyhow, in the big operations, you can see they make these long rows like that, and then they have a machine that goes along and turning it, turning it up, because that's part of the thing with composting. You want to turn it, if you're trying to make fast compost, you turn it periodically so that it gets all mixed up. Just like when you're baking a cake or you're baking bread, you want to mix the ingredients up really well so that the yeast gets, distributed throughout the bread. Same idea, all the little organisms, you want to get them all mixed up inside the thing so that it will decompose evenly. In your home composting bin, you're just tossing stuff in there. You can make them out of wood. Sometimes people just make a wire circle like that and just drop stuff in there. And then when it, takes time, it'll take longer time than when they're making compost this way. In fact, I think I got a slide here. Well, we'll get to it here in a minute. Commercial compost, there's different kinds. So like you can buy composted manure. There's a product we used to sell here called composted cotton burr or cotton burr compost. That's what's after they grow cotton plants. It's a little part of the shell sort of that holds the cotton ball, the fluffy part. It's kind of what's left over after that, and then compost that. And then there's just a generic compost. Um, it's just like what you saw in the last picture, is from a place like that where they compost like leaves and wood chips and grass clippings and yard waste type stuff. And so what we used to have is we used to sell this kind, and then this year, for some reason, the company we've been buying from, which had the best because it was organic, because cotton lots of times they spray stuff on it, but this was organic cotton, and they got bought by a new company and they literally raised the price twice. So you can still buy this if you want to go to someplace like Soil Service Garden Center. And we use that sometimes just as a mulch on top of it because it kind of looks like shredded bark, but much, much better. So then you can fill it in at the end of the year and adding compost to your soil, but we use it as mulch too. So we'll probably still use it in our children's garden. The composted manure is great, but if you get too much down at once and it gets wet, then it gets kind of nasty. But if you're working in the fall and fill it in good. And then and that they actually did put a percentage on it, but it's less than 1/20th of 1%. So it's very low in nutrients, but it's good in providing the texture. And then this is what we are now selling. We've been buying this from Suburban Lawn and Garden. It's just that compost that's made out of leaves and grass clippings and ground up wood chips. And they do a good job on it. It's also OMRI certified. If you ever see on the product something that says OMRI certified, that means it is certified as organic. So you can be sure that it's not going to mess you up with any kind of bad chemicals. Well done. Completely composted. We used to buy some compost from a company farther down this way, and sometimes we get stuff that would have wood chips in it. It wouldn't be all decomposed, and so it still kind of be kind of chunky. So we don't buy from them anymore. And then the homemade compost, there's different reasons for composting at home. One is, of course, you want to generate compost that you can add back to your soil, right? But other people like to do it mainly just to recycle their organic, so that you're not putting stuff into the landfill. Yeah. Tasty organic. Yeah, that's what we want. I'll tell you about that. So if you've got all your kitchen scrap or you've got rotten vegetables, that kind of stuff, by adding that to your compost, you can't just throw just that in there. You have to add other stuff. Like it'd be good to add some leaves in on top of that, some grass clippings on top of that, a little bit of soil on top of that, and that will help that all decompose. So some people do the compost bins where you have like 3 of them going like that, and you've always got one that's kind of mostly done, one that's kind of in between done, and one that you're just starting and building a pile. Some people like to use these barrels. They don't hold very much. But the idea is that, like for the kitchen scrap, you can throw stuff in there and it's not going to smell. You can turn it real easy because the barrel has a cranker on it, and so it's a great way to make some small amounts of compost, especially if you're trying to recycle all the kitchen scraps and things like that. The homemade compost, there's the fast method. We talked about the commercial guys do it, and that's where you get real scientific about it. You're layering the materials. They talk about green materials and brown materials. So brown materials would be something like leaves. If you collect your leaves and just let them pile up. And you could just let your leaves pile up and just, if you have room in your yard, that's what I do. I just let them pile up and they'll sit there for like 2 years and eventually they'll shrink down and turn into nice compost. It doesn't happen fast because there's no green material in there that has nitrogen that helps break it down. So what they recommend is like that you might take like some leaves and then have a layer of green stuff, which could be something like manure. It could also be just like grass clippings, from the yard, green grass clippings. But there's some leaves and then maybe some soil, some more green stuff, some leaves, then, put a little bit of water in between and then build it like 4 feet high and 4 feet wide. Because if you make it just like 1 foot high and 1 foot wide, there's not going to be enough mass. It's almost like a nuclear reactor or something. You need enough critical mass to make it really start taking off. And you can do that. You keep it moist and you turn it, a couple times, 2 or 3 times during that 14 days. You can get compost made in about 14 days if you kind of follow that recipe. But most gardeners I know, and myself included, I don't have time for that. And you don't get that much compost that you're going to be able. If I needed a lot of compost, I'd probably just buy it. So the slow method is where you just add stuff periodically whenever you pull out the plants from the garden, rather than throw them away. You just toss them in the bin, and they'll start breaking down. So again, you see here's stuff that's already decomposed. You see how it's shrunken down, and then here's some leaves that are in the middle, and then here's some fresh stuff that's been added on. So that'll take longer. And if you can, during dry periods, if you can wet it down a little bit, that'll help it decompose. Because if it's not moist, it's not going to decompose. If you just have a stack of dry brown leaves, they'll sit there for a long time. If you mix it wet, that's when things start to rot and decompose. But still, this kind of composting might take several months, but that's okay. You don't have to be in a hurry for it. And then eventually you'll have some nice compost. All right, we will. Yeah, I think that's all in the compost. We're still talking about what makes a good soil. I got questions. Yeah, so when compost is done, it's ready to use. You don't have to wait. Oh, yes, you can wait. Yeah. The thing is, if you have a way to fatten it, that will help any nutrients that are in there from leaching out. If you just left it sitting out and the rain rains on it, it's kind of washing the nutrients out. So yeah, we could that definitely. Yeah. So the other characteristic of good soil, besides having lots of organic matter, is to have a good pH. Remember, pH is the measurement of how acid or how alkaline the soil is. If the pH is too high or too low, sometimes plant nutrients aren't available. And the plant can't take them out because it's just either too alkaline or too acid. And so the pH will affect that. It will affect the microbes and the plant growth. So you definitely kind of want to be somewhere in the middle. And the way the scale works is 7 is neutral, 8 is more alkaline, 6 is more acid. The best range for vegetables is slightly acid, 6.0 to 7. And so around here, we generally going to be more on the alkaline side, so it's really not unusual to have like 7.2, 7.3, 7.4. And this is something that your soil test will tell you. So this is where that does get useful. The other thing just to be aware of, this is what they call, it's an exponential scale, which means that, so a measurement of 8 is 10 times as alkaline as 7. And measurement of 9 would be 100 times alkaline. So you will never see a soil like 9. You'll never see a soil like at 8. Maybe in the desert somewhere you can see that. But around here it's going to be in the low 7, like 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. And that's okay. But it would be better if it was just slightly like a 6.5 or a 6.8. So that's where your soil test can help you, and we'll talk about how you would change that here. Slightly acidy good. The other thing is, in lots of other parts of the country, the soils are already acid, and sometimes it's too acid, and they have to add lime. So if you ever hear like somebody talking about, especially gardeners from the East Coast or farmers, old farmers, and yeah, you got put the lime on your garden every year. That's a bad idea over here because we already have enough lime. In fact, almost all the rocks that you see around Kansas City, you see a construction site, that's all limestone. All the caves that they have here in Kansas City are limestone caves. That is what the parent rock is, limestone. That's when they get lime, they grind it up and add that pH to it. Makes the pH higher. So you don't want to do that. You never need to add lime. I would be real surprised if you ever got a recommendation that you need to add lime. So, I'm glad that you got that. to change the pH, you look at that soil test, it'll tell you how to do it. And the way to make it lower is to add sulfur. And you can buy a bag at the garden center, soil sulfur. And that soil test will tell you how much to add. Like it's say like 1 pound for 100 square feet and 2 pounds for 100 square feet. And that will tell you, how much sulfur to add to make the pH down to where that ideal is about 6.5 or 6.8. Now, the limestone or wood ashes, you can use to raise the pH to make it more alkaline, but you're not wanting to do that. I'm just telling you that in case you ever hear people. Yes, in Kansas City, you're more likely to need sulfur, not lime. Also, sometimes people will read about adding wood ashes from the fireplace to the soil because it's a good source of potassium. It is a good source of potassium, but it also will raise the pH. So maybe do it once, but that would be like the only time you would do it. If you did it every year, it would just make it way too alkaline. The other thing is this adding the material to change the pH in the fall because it takes time. You can't just do it and sprinkle it on top. That sulfur, you have to mix it in and then have to sit there for a while. And it's better to like till it in like 6 inches deep. Now, the other thing this comes into play, if you ever want to grow something like blueberries, they need a very acid. So I strongly recommend if you want to grow blueberries, make a raised bed, get a soil test, and it will tell you how much sulfur to add, and then do it in the fall and till it in, and then plant the blueberries the following spring. Almost every gardener I know who wants to grow blueberries tries to take the shortcut and just say, well, it can't be that. We're selling it together. And I've done that, and then blueberry plants get sick and they die, and it's not happy. Same things like if you're a flower grower, you go azaleas or rhododendrons, they like that happen to us. Yeah, so you still need to keep an eye on that pH because eventually it does start rising. Yeah, you would want to do that in the fall, and it's a little bit more difficult adding the soil sulfur second because you don't want to chill right around your blueberries, right? So you would just make a tiny little trench, kind of like with a trowel, and come in around that. But again, you test the soil. The blueberries, I would test my soil probably every 3 years, and they'll tell you to add a little more sulfur. I wouldn't, although there is kind of a new trick that I just read about. You're probably aware that vinegar is acid. If your blueberries are showing signs of the pH not being low enough, and the sign would be if your leaves would be turning yellow on your blueberries, that's a sign that they're not getting enough acid, And so if you see that on your blueberries, you could like buy a gallon of vinegar from, the store, Walmart, pretty cheap, and put it in your sprinkling pan, maybe mix it about half water, half vinegar, water with that a couple of times, and that will get the acid right down to the and it won't burn you. It's not that strong. Just blueberries. They're the only ones that need that really acid for. Their pH that they like is about 5.0 to 5.5. So think of that, that's like 100 times more acid than neutral in 7. So that's why they use some salt to do that. Blueberries are tricky, but once you get them going, there's almost no work involved after that. You prune them a lot, you don't have to give them other special stuff. Then it's put on trellis. So really it's great once you get that pH. Yeah, so I'd give them their own bag, because the other stuff would be too hot. But for most things, you don't need to buy. But if you're having difficulty in your garden, worth getting that soil test. If your pH was like up to 7.8, then you definitely would want to add some sulfur. If it's 7.2, you can usually get by. It's less than perfect, but it doesn't seem to be a big problem. So So another characteristic of good soil is going to be deep. Good soil is usually 8 to 12 inches of good topsoil. And then there's kind of a subsoil underneath that. So in the soil class, they talk about the top one is called the A horizon, 8 to 12 inches of good topsoil. And then there's the B horizon, so it's the next, 8 to 20 inches of medium stuff. And then down below is really bad stuff, the C horizon, rock and stuff. The problem is around here in Kansas City, we have a lot of clay in the subsoil. Now, if someone says, yeah, and like some people, I live in Clay County and all we have is clay. That's not what that is. But what happens around almost every subdivision, so newer subdivisions or anything in the last 50 years, and they build houses, they scrape away that top layer of top. They pile it up because, they want to build a house, dig the basement out. They're running a bulldozer over it, always clay. But they actually like clay around the house because that makes good packing so it doesn't settle and everything. So they'll pack that clay in there. And then they'll go back and put 2 inches of topsoil back on top, and then they'll slap some sod on top of that. And if you water it, fertilize it, it will actually grow. But then you're trying to plant stuff inside that. Maybe, I ran into this when I was having my first garden. When I was 12 years old, my dad had me start making gardens, and right up against the house, we were planting flower bulbs, and it was terrible clay. So we had to totally replace that soil. But back towards the back of the bulldozers hadn't been back there, and it was a nice soil, 7 or 8 inches of top. And it was much, much better. So that's why I put the garden back there. But, if all your topsoil is gone and you get clay pretty quick, it's worth building a raised bed and bringing soil to make it better. We'll talk about that here. But the other thing is when they run the bulldozer over that clay, that packs it down even harder. So it just makes it so the roots can't penetrate, water can't get through, and it's really, really bad. So that unfortunately is one of the things of the newer subdivisions. Now, a really good builder, and there are some really good builders, will put back all the topsoil out of the house. Some of them fell off the extra topsoil. If you are going to purchase soil, if you want to make a raised bed, or we're going to have a ground plot and we just want to add some good stuff to it. And if you go buy stuff in bags, it'll help some, but you have to buy, if you have a big garden, you have to buy literally hundreds of bags to get enough organic. So what I recommend is purchasing, especially for raised beds. This is what we use in all our raised beds. It's a mixture of half compost, and half topsoil. And we buy it from a company called Casey Organic. They're out there in Belton area, and we really like they used to be called lawn mowers. And because they were basically recycling trash into grass and leaves and all that kind of stuff. But they make really good compost. They do a good job, and they're reasonable. And you can drive out there and get a pickup load for like 35 or 40 bucks. And you got to shovel it yourself. But if you got some friends to help you, got some wheelbarrows, you can do that and fill up a raised bed. If you need a lot, you can get a dump truck load. And it still costs like $35 a cubic yard, and the dump truck load could be anywhere from 2 cubic yards to 12 or 15 cubic yards. When we build a big garden, we get about 15 yards dumped off at once. And there's usually delivery fees, and it's usually like 60 or 75 bucks. So that's why it's worth it to get more. And if you have extra, then you can spread it around and use it somewhere else. So we've been really, really happy with it. There's another compost company, or I'm not going to mention their name, but we used to buy from them, but we got unhappy with them because the soil that they were blending in seemed awful sandy, and it packed down really hard, and it didn't seem like it had very much organic. But the compost was okay, although sometimes it has more wood chips than I like, you know. So we just gave up on them and started buying KC Compost out there. And they're really nice to us. They work with us. They get our stuff delivered on time. If you do get a truck up, a dump truck load, make sure you got a good place to put it. I usually recommend putting down a cart so you can catch it all if it doesn't spread out too much into the grass. And then after they dump it, I recommend putting the top on top because if it starts with raining, you do not want to get all turned into a pile before you can get it. Because like when I got a truckload at my house, it took me like 2 weeks to get all wheelbarrows in the backyard because I wasn't trying to do it all in a day. I would just take a few wheelbarrows a day. But anyhow, so if you want to get as close to the garden as possible, so you don't have very far to do that. It really is great stuff and can really make your garden grow. With our school gardens, with our community gardens, we can guarantee that they will have success if they use this blend of 50-50 topsoil. So back to that good structure, good soils will have that adequate pore space, meaning the air spaces in between the particles and organic matter will help that pore space to be good. Clay soils just don't have very much pore space. And if you have good soil structure, you know it because your soil will crumble. In fact, they talk about the test to see if your garden's ready to till. It should be moist enough. You can take a handful of squeeze into the ball, but then you can take your fingers and it crumbles and falls apart. If it stays all sticky, it's too wet, and also it could mean that you have too much flow. So you don't want to till the soil when it's wet. You'll turn things into little mud balls, and you don't want to till it too much when it's too dry and go over it too many times. Because what it does is it breaks it into smaller and smaller particles, and pretty soon you lose that pore space in between because the particle size gets too tiny, it's too fine. So, usually tilling just twice, going over twice or 3 times a year. Yeah. And you till too many times. That's what I'm telling you. Yeah. You mean in 1 year? Yeah. But yeah. I feel it fall. Okay. Or it goes over the winter. Yeah. I feel it spring before I start. That's not too much. That's actually what I recommend. I recommend in the fall tilling it. So then if you had in the mulch and you plant stuff on top, you fill it in. The other thing that tilling in the fall does is lots of times there will be insect eggs. I think notably like the squash bugs, they lay their eggs just up in the top into the soil. And when you go on and till that fall, that buries them down deep. And so that's a good thing to do. And again, now also that'll just, if you have the mulch on top, that'll get mixed in, or if you decide you want to have sulfur, fill it in the fall, and it will get packed down if it rains over the season, over the winter, but then it'll be in much better shape, ready to go in the spring. So then in the spring, what I say is look for sometime in late February, early March, when it's not wet. Sometimes you just have times in March where it just rains every 2 days. You don't get a dry, you can't get out there, and you can't fill up your garden because it's too much. But lots of times, like this year, we had some nice days where it dried up enough. You can go out and till in late February, early March, and get your garden all ready. At least for spring, for your early spring crop, like the lettuce and the spinach and broccoli and potatoes, get that filled up. And then later on, you can fill up some more space with tomatoes and peppers like that. But yeah, no, that's not tilling too much. But like I say, I remember seeing some gardeners go out and he was having such a good time filming his garden. It's so beautiful. He just went over, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and just tilling all over because he wanted to be just like perfect, it's okay if there's some little clumps. But usually a couple times is enough. The first year of tilling is the hardest. If you have lawn, sod, to go out and till that with a rototiller is hard. If you've never run a tiller before, really hard. And if your tiller is just the basic one like the rental place, usually they aren't that powerful. So I recommend the first year paying somebody to till up a new garden. Somebody with a small tractor like that, they can just fill that sod up. I mean, you could remove the sod first if you want to go to that trouble, but it's okay. You can just fill it under. Um, and then, so that first year is the hardest. And after that, it's not so hard to till, as long as you don't let it get overgrown with grass or weeds. And if it's the right moisture, like in a raised bed, you know, it's really, you may not even need to till. You can just take a fork and flip it over or a shovel, and it'll just be the perfect thing to do that. So again, fall, spading, or plowing or tilling gets the garden ready for spring. The other thing is you want to avoid compacting soil. So that's why the tractor, I probably only have that coming once, because after that, tractor will compact the soil now. It is tilling it up behind it. And even when you're tilling in your garden, I try to like till it from the side like this, so I'm not walking in much of this till, so I'm not leaving it first. But you know, sometimes it's hard to do. But again, you never want to till when the soil is too wet. So the other characteristic of good soil is good drainage. And this is something you might notice when you're thinking about where you're going to put your garden. Look in your yard after a big rain. If you see standing water, you know, in certain places, like the next day, that's not a good place. That means it drains too slow. Probably too much clay down there. If the soil is well drained in a ground plot, it should all be gone after a rain 24 hours later. You should not see any water. So that's why sometimes if you do have that lots of clay, it's worth building raised beds because they will drain really well. So there is kind of a drainage test you can do if you're not sure. Is you can dig a hole, they say like 1 foot deep and 1 foot wide, so like a square, 1 foot deep, and then what was straight sides, don't make it like this, straight sides, and then literally turn on the hose and just fill that hole up with water. And then that should be gone 24 hours later. It should not be any water left in the hole. And that will let you know if you have good drainage. Other characteristic is freedom from toxic materials. That is generally not a problem unless somebody before you put down some toxic weed killers or stuff. You know, different people have different philosophies about using chemicals. I would not use a weed killer in space where I want to garden. So, you know, if you had a garden and for some reason in the community garden, you have to be careful about where we put community garden. You would not want to put a community garden on the site where you you know, or a dry cleaner. It's something where you know there's some sort of paint spraying operation. There would be chemicals in that. But generally there's not going to be that kind of stuff that dark. So you don't need to worry about that. What can be a bigger problem sometimes is weed seeds and, you know, aggressive perennials. So weed seeds, you can help control that. If you get weeds to grow up in the garden and get away from you, get rid of those weeds before they start to grow seeds. A lot of those things like lamb quarters and pigweed, those are annual weeds. They'll put out literally thousands. One time they'll put out thousands, you know, these sprouts in the next year. So even if you can't take care of your garden, at least go down to a weed eater or a mower and cut it down so that the weeds don't go ahead and flower and go to seed. Aggressive perennials would be things like, oh gosh, like Bermuda grass, or that's a really bad grass that sometimes gets mixed in with one, two, and it just spreads by these underground rhizomes, take over the place. It's really difficult to. I mean, sometimes we'll find an empty lot that's totally overgrown with Bermuda grass, and it's probably not a good place to start. There's also Johnson grass, sometimes in the soil mixture, to buy soil, because it came from a farm somewhere. Sometimes we'll have this grass called Johnson grass. And if you see that sprouting up, you want to get rid of that because it spreads like. Then the other plant you'll see sometimes a weed is called bindweed, and you'll hear farmers talk about either least favorite plant, which is terrible weed. And it looks like little tiny morning glories, little vines growing on the ground, like little tiny white flowers about that tree. And it just spreads all over the place. You let that go, it'll take over the food. And even things like mint. Which I never recommend planting this in your raised bed or your vegetable garden. Mint, you should grow it in a pot so the roots take over And we've had community garden plots or some plants that fit, rain bed, and you just take over the that. Nobody else can garden. We've literally had to remove the entire soil and then put something new. Now, I have a mixed patch in my backyard. It's about this big, but it's totally surrounded by grass. So I'm mowing it all the time, so it can't spread out. So you can do it that way, or you can put it in a pot and or make a very small raised bed, and have your mixed patch there. All right, soil testing. So there is a way you can just physically look at the soil yourself if you're not sure if you have good soil. I remember doing this once when we were going to buy a house, and I wanted to see what the soil looked like. And I thought it was probably good, but if I'm buying this one house, I want to know what have I got. So I literally asked the people, would you be okay if I took a shovel and just turned one shovel full over just to see what it looked like? He said, sure, go ahead. And so I did that. And so when I did it, it looked like that. It was nice, dark. It crumbled nicely, and that's kind of what we call the shovel test. If it's clay, it's going to be more tan, it's sticky, and it won't just crumble apart. So if you have that, then you know what you're dealing with. You got clay, you're going to have to deal with it. Most likely it'll be somewhere in between. But if you got really good topsoil, usually it's darker. Although even topsoil when it's dry will be lighter in color, and then when it's moist, it'll look darker. So that's kind of what you see how the soil on top is dry, but came out the shovel and it's a little bit mixed. So that's just the shovel test, just by looking. But a lab test, so the way you do that is you collect some soil, and let's say you have a garden, I don't know, as big as this square out here. You might go to 4 different places and you can take 4 shovels from different places in the garden. But it kind of happens. If you take it from one place, that place might be different. It might have more nutrients or it might have less. But if you take it from several places, it'll be kind of an average. And so what you do is you take a shovel and slice down, it's like an inch, and you go down, well, it says a half inch. It's hard to do a half inch with a shovel. I would probably do an inch. And then get a nice little slice like that. And, if there's sod on it, you have to take a little bit of sod off so you're not just getting a whole bunch of sod. And just collect it and then drop that in a bucket. And you take your 4 different little slices, drop them in a bucket, and then mix it all up. You can let it dry a little bit, and then you're going to send it off to the lab, and the lab would be at the University Extension Service. So if you're in Kansas, it'll be the Kansas Extension Service out there in Olathe. It's the Missouri Extension Service. They used to have a downtown office, but now it's used for that. So there is a fee. Although in Kansas, there is a simple soil test that I believe if you're a Kansas resident, you can get one for free. I don't know if they still do that. I have to look at their website and see. But yeah, the fee used to be about $10. Now I think it's like 15, 17 bucks typically. And then it'll come back to you, and what they want you to ship them is about a pint of soil. And if you look on their website, it'll have instructions about putting in the little plastic bag, how to do it. They'll tell you how to do that. Make sure you're right on it. And they're going to have you fill out a form and ask you, what are you going to grow? Well, if you're going to grow a bunch of different vegetables, just say, vegetables. But if you're going to grow blueberries, you would want to write blueberries in them just so they know this is exactly what you're doing. Or if it's just shrubs or whatever, they'll make some recommendations based on that. So when you get your soil test, this is what you want to be watching for. We'll look at a bigger thing here. But this is what it looks like. They'll email this back to you. Unless you don't do email, then they'll just mail it back to you. And, it'll have your name up there. It'll have the date and all that stuff. It'll have some soil test results. It'll tell you, you need any limestone, which around here you don't, etc. So here's it blown up a little bit so you can see it better. So here you look at the pH on this soil test, 7.6. So you see that says very high. So that means you need to do something about that. So they're going to recommend, says this soil pH is too high for vegetables. or lowering the pH, apply 20 pounds of finely ground sulfur per 1,000 square feet. So that would be 2 pounds per 100 square feet. You can figure out how much you need based on how big your garden is. And if you need somebody to help you figure out that, we can call us and we can help you figure that out after you get your soil test. Like I've had some gardeners say, can I send this to you? And they'll email it to me, and then I can help them interpret it. Because sometimes you look at this and think, what does this mean? What am I supposed to do? But if you do that sulfur, they're telling you to do at least 6 months before planting and work it into the soil so it will be effective. So they're saying, it's a good idea maybe to do this every 2 or 3 years. I haven't tested my soil at my house probably 10 years, just because I just keep adding organic matter and everything seems to be looking fine, so I don't worry about it. Anyhow, so it looks like the phosphorus has that much measurement, which doesn't mean anything to me. But if you look at it, it says it's very high. So that means I don't need to add any phosphorus. Then you look at the potassium, and it's got that much in it, and it says very high. Oh, it says excess. So it's got too much potassium. So you do not want to add any fertilizer that would have potassium because it would be too strong. And then the calcium, it's showing is medium, so that's good. Magnesium is high, but not too high, that's good. Now, the one thing you won't see up there, although I've seen some soil tests, is they don't even show you the nitrogen. And that's because the nitrogen is so volatile, it's changing all the time. And so you can't really time it. So what you got to think in your mind is, I want to add enough nitrogen for what I'm growing. So that's when you're adding like 2 pounds of chicken manure, for 100 square feet, you're adding enough nitrogen for this year's crop. So that means if you're low on nitrogen, that's okay. If you've already got some nitrogen, fine. The only reason you would have too much nitrogen would be like if you added a whole bunch of chemical fertilizer, or if you just dumped a whole bunch of fresh manure. That's probably the only thing that's getting too much. And so the nitrogen is always going to be changing. So it's always losing, evaporating out of the air, washing through the soil. So nitrogen will not be on there. But the other thing is, it says the organic matter percentage, and that tells you what percent of your soil is organic. So just so you know, 5% is considered good. This is 23%. So what I'm guessing is this was a raised bed where they had like half compost and half topsoil, so they have lots of it. And sometimes they'll say something like, "That's too much." Don't really, you can't have to. You have to have like, I don't know. Some people will grow just in compost, like a potting soil, but you'd have to have like, I don't know, 60, 70, 80%. And even still, it would be fine. It's not gonna hurt. But so if you can be above 5%, you can be 10%. That's awesome. 20% is awesome.
If a person got that report says pH is high for vegetables, what do you do? Not 20?
Yeah, see, that's the thing I don't like about that. It's like, whoa, I guess so. I guess I just give up gardening, right? You gotta wait 6 months. I would go ahead and plant. They're saying it's too high for optimum production. So we have grown, I think gardens grow in 7.6. They just maybe don't grow quite as well. They'll be okay. But yeah.
So that instance, could you then put organic fertilizer and it's a lot less strong? Maybe better for like this one versus
so there is no such thing as really organic salt if you want to add salt. And so that's a mineral. And so it's just going to be so you could try the vinegar. You could do a couple of waterings if you didn't have too big a garden. Just the plant would get a little shot of the vinegar. I would mix it half with water, and just a little bit, and that would help for the 1 year until the fall. Then you can actually do salt with that. Trust the method. Okay. So anyhow, so that's what it looks like. Again, it's telling you like if your soil was low, it would be telling you to add, is low in phosphorus, it'd be telling you to add a certain amount of pounds of that, but you're not low in there. You're only place there, you don't need any lime. So it's really that sulfur that they're telling you to add. So sometimes I get questions about testing for lead in soil, and we are almost done. Testing for lead in the soil. And you know, lead is not good, obviously, and it's not good to have in the soil. We have not found it to generally be a problem around here. I have some friends in St. Louis, live in a much older part of town. There is a lot of lead in their soil, in the house there is lead, all kinds of problems. So I don't worry about normally getting a test for lead in the soil unless you were like right along a major highway, and I mean like right along, you know, within, you know, less than 100 feet, or a major roadway, because back in the day, they used to have leaded gasoline and gasoline fumes settle on the ground. Another case would be if your garden happens to be located on a site that used to be an apple orchard, like 100 years ago, because they used to use a lot of lead arsenic, chemicals to kill insects, so they use that. The other thing, the most likely scenarios where you might get too much lead is in an older house. And so, in fact, we did some tests in different locations around the city, different types of gardens. We did some empty lot, did some backyard gardens, different places, community gardens, and then this is one I thought might be test. You know, an older house, we've got the little driveway, and in between the driveway and the house, there's usually strips about this big. And sometimes people have shrubs planted in there, flowers. Sometimes people plant vegetables. The thing is, back in the day when they had leaded paint, there was lead in the paint, so then we repaint, you know, every 5 years or whatever, we scrape that paint off, flakes down right into that little patch of soil. And so we actually tested one of those locations, which was very high. And so the people said, well, what do we do? I said, well, you can grow flowers there, or with lead, if you plant different kinds of crops, take up the lead. So leafy stuff like lettuce and spinach and chard, that stuff will take the lead up, and you'll be eating those leaves, so that's not good. But like tomatoes and things like that, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, peppers, things that are fruiting vegetables, so that's what they are, that's a fruit, comes from a flower being pollinated, and tomato forms, pepper forms, and squash, watermelon, cucumbers. The lead will go into the leaves, but it doesn't go into that fruit. So if you go tomatoes there, but the other thing is if you have like children, they say, you know, you don't want to have any contact with the soil, you know, if you wouldn't want them playing in the dirt there. So, you know, you could just mulch it. But that would be the only kind of place that I would actually worry about lead. And it's actually more than lead, it's also cadmium is another heavy metal, and nickel, I think, is another heavy metal. Usually lead is the one that's the biggest problem. So anyhow, don't need to worry about that too much, but just wanted to be aware in case somebody says, well, do we need to test for lead? What do we need to do? I would generally not worry about that unless you, again, we're in like an older place, possibly a previous apple orchard, or near the highway, or right up against the house, or on an empty lot where a house is being torn down. Sometimes a house is being torn down, they'll just take a lot of that stuff and just all get pushed into the center and fill up the area. Almost done here. So sometimes you'll hear about soil amendment, and all that means is something that you add to the soil to improve the condition of the soil, and then it will also help the things grow better. So fertilizer is really an amendment. I mean, you are adding something, but it's more of a concentrated thing. So, so a soil amendment could be stuff like manure, could be a nutrient like the soil sulfur, could be just a compost that you buy in a bag. So again, so it might be for different reasons. Might be just trying to add organic matter, or in the case of the pH, the sulfur might just be that to just that. If your plants were really low in phosphorus, you might add something like bone meal. So those are different kinds of soil. But usually, so they can be organic or inorganic. And if it's inorganic, that doesn't mean it's bad. It might be a mineral like sulfur or something else, or the bone meal, phosphorus. Or actually, bone meal. It may or may not provide much nutrients, like the compost. We said some of that doesn't have a lot of nutrients. But lots of times what it is, it's improving the physical condition of the soil, makes it easier to work, or the chemical condition of the soil, meaning adding nutrients, or both. And it can be something you buy, or it can be something free. You can get free manure, or if you get free leads, save all your let me see if we got any more slides here. There's organic soil amendment compost, which has already been composted. Seeds, straw, manure, grass clippings. You can buy alfalfa meal, you can buy bone meal, blood meal. The non-organic soil amendments are things like lime, which is not recommending, sulfur, rock phosphate, clean sand, has potassium in it. Ground granite has potassium. Sand, sometimes people add that in the soil amendment because they think it'll make it looser. I'd rather add organic sand. If you buy sand from somewhere, sometimes it came from the river, it has toxic chemicals in it from the river, so I probably would not do that. To add soil amendments, calculate how much you're going to add, you spread it over the whole soil surface, and then you incorporate it in. All that means is fill it in, or at least take a fork and turn it in. If you're going to buy something in the bag to improve your soil, I would recommend buying Cottonburg compost, or that compost now that it's selling out there. So, don't buy shredded bark. Don't buy manure is okay, but just don't want very much of it. So just to improve the soil, Cottonburg compost or the straight generic compost we're selling is probably the best stuff. Or go get yourself a pickup load. Your soil wasn't formed in one season, so it might take it more than one season to get it in there. If you keep adding, you got bad soil and you add good organic matter, every year for 2 or 3 years, then you won't need to do it every year after. But it's definitely one of the most worthwhile things you can do to your garden. If you're going to spend some energy, it's worth, adding some organic matter to the soil, especially once at the beginning and filling it in. So it'll be good. And it's not going to be just a one-time thing. One of the easiest ways to do it, to add organic matter, is like you use a mulch, whether it's straw or grass clippings or Cottonburg compost or shredded leaves, and put that 2 inches of layer on top. And then at the end of the season, pulling out your plant, and that's when you till your garden in the fall, and you'll incorporate that mulch into your garden, so you've added your organic. So it's really beautiful.